everybody, this is the Wikstrand. So, Red Heat has this cultural achievement badge that it likes to, show around. That it was the first Hollywood movie to have been shot at Red Square in Moscow. Now, that is, partially true. They actually shot, pieces of the movie on Red Square, but they were not actually allowed to do that. They tried to get permission to film there, but they were denied. But they did it anyway, sort of guerrilla style, just putting up Arnold there with his, uniform and just shooting him for a few minutes, and then they inserted it into the movie. I always wondered why that sequence looked a little staged, and now I know. But that is not the only perk this movie has. Let's find out what other perks they have, because let's go back to 1988, Glasnost, the last leg of the Soviet Union and the end of the Reagan era, and see what happens when a Soviet cop and a Chicago cop tries to hunt down a dangerous drug lord. This is Red Heat. Plays Russian cop Ivan Danko, who is going to try to apprehend the Georgian drug dealer Victor, leading to probably the most famous sequence in the entire movie, when he goes into this bar and he rips up this guy, and it turns out that he had a fake leg, and the fake leg contains cocaine, and he pours it on the floor and says "cocaino," which leads to a fairly fun chase and a fairly okay shootout where Danko's partner is killed by Victor, who slips away and then goes to the United States. And he is then apprehended by the Chicago Police Department for a minor misdemeanor. When Moscow finds out that Victor is in Chicago, they sends Ivan there to retrieve him, and tells him not to get too familiar with the Americans and don't expose why we want Victor that much, because he's very dangerous and stuff like that. So he goes there and he meets up with the Chicago Police Department, and some culture clashes ensues. And Victor, well, he escapes when they try to transport him from one location to the other. Never ever ever transport a prisoner of some description, or even the hero, from one location to the other. They will always escape, or there will be a flat tire or something like that. They will always escape. So Ivan Danko and a rough and ready Chicago cop played by Jim Belushi is going to have to team up together to try to, bring Victor down. Jim Belushi has his own reasons for wanting to capture Victor, because he has also killed his partner, and they're going to try to cooperate together as best they can to bring Victor down, even though they don't have anything in common and they're constantly bickering with each other. Classical, 1980s formula for you. One thing I really like about Red Heat is the concept of the whole thing, because it was very rare in the late 80s to see a movie where our main character, our hero, actually was a Russian. I think Arnold put off a pretty decent Russian accent, and actually, spent a few months trying to, learn to speak Russian. I don't know how good his Russian is, because I don't speak Russian, but I think that was a fun concept. I always like the, fish out the water story, even though I think that it could have been even more interesting if this movie would have been Jim Belushi has to go to Moscow and has to team up with Arnold in order to track down Victor, because I thought that the things in Russia was the more interesting thing, but it probably would have costed too much and it probably wouldn't have made any sense. So I guess that was the logical thing to do. One thing I did not like about this movie, however, was the atmosphere of this movie, the tone of this movie, because they were trying to kind of do two things at the same time, because they were both trying to do a very hard, very realistic, very gritty action movie. They were also kind of trying to do a classical 1980s buddy cop movie, and I love the relationship between Jim Belushi and Arnold Schwarzenegger. They have great chemistry together. The comedy is basically the following. Jim Belushi says 500 words in rapid fashion, which makes Arnold utter 2 words which punctuate the whole thing. It is a very tried and tested formula, and it worked great. And the chemistry, as I said, between them was excellent. But the thing is that it was a little bit too funny to really be taken seriously, and it was too serious to really, make the jokes that they had work. I mean, Arnold is a bit toned down in this movie. He doesn't, rely on catchphrases and stuff like that. It's more of a stoic performances, bouncing off the more energetic Belushi. But the thing is that I think that the pairing should have been something else. Or have Shane Black write this movie, because Shane Black is an absolute master of writing this kind of a stories without having to sacrifice neither the suspense or the comedy. But this rough and gritty way of making movies has always been sort of the staple of Walter Hill. Maybe that is the reason why I don't really like his movies as much as I would have liked to. I don't really like the, 48 hours movies and stuff like that. My favorite movie of his is probably Southern Comfort, but that's a story for another time. So we do have a bunch of, shootouts. We have a bunch of fairly okay action sequences with Arnold doing cool stuff with his gigantic hand cannon. Jesus Christ, the size of his gun. Did he steal that from RoboCop or something like that? That gun was absolutely fantastic. We also have a bunch of, fairly interesting side characters. Gina Gershon plays Victor's American wife, who basically has a gigantic sign hanging around her neck that says, "Will die, will not redeem herself." But even I could figure that one out when I was like 10 years old and seeing this movie the first time. So that's not that much of a spoiler, actually. And it is fairly entertaining, it is fairly suspenseful, and it ends with a fairly spectacular bus chase throughout Chicago, so big plus for that. But sadly, this movie doesn't have the spectacular flashiness of a movie like Beverly Hills Cop Part 2, and it doesn't really have the dark grittiness that Black Rain had, which came out, a year later, which actually made me think that maybe the best pairing in this movie should have been Arnold Schwarzenegger and Michael Douglas, because Michael Douglas was just an expert of playing this type of a character. And speaking of Black Rain, a great movie that actually deals with the culture differences in a much more interesting way than this movie did. It didn't really bring out the difference between the United States and the Soviet Union in a way I thought could have been. They really didn't utilize the full concept of having Soviet cop in Chicago and using it to its full potential. But it was still an interesting idea. But they do address it from time to time, and some of it was actually kind of sweet, and some of it was actually kind of funny, and some of it was actually quite profound. So, well, they did some, but they could have done more. So, is Red Heat a movie that you should see? If you have never seen it, go and see it. It is a fairly good 80s action movie. If you have seen it, there is no reason to re-watch it. It will be approximately as good as you thought it was when you saw it the last time, which probably was quite a long time ago. But it's still a fairly entertaining and suspenseful action movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger in his absolute prime. And if that sounds like your cup of tea, it will be your cup of tea. But he has done better, and also he has done worse. But this was a pretty damn good movie. Decent action sequences, despite the fact that they can get a little bit formulaic and they don't have a good variety to themselves. Great interactions and great chemistry between our two main leads gives this movie an easily 60 points. It is a good action movie. It is a good cop movie with a little bit of a twist, which they don't utilize to its fullest, but it is still a good action movie. Nothing more, nothing less. The sequences in Russia was the most fascinating, and I kind of wish that that portion of the movie could have been a little bit longer, but hey ho, what you gonna do? It should also be said that Victor isn't the most fun or entertaining or unique villain of all time, but he was decent, I guess. So I'll see you next time for Well So and So reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.